Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. Hi, today is May 13th, 2025, Tuesday, right after U.S. China delegations met in Switzerland and made a tentative, I would say, consensus or agreement or deal, depends on how you interpret it, to reduce the tariff rate. I mean, obviously, this is one of the biggest news. I will quickly explain the situation and thinking about going forward. First, I think, everybody knows that since Liberation Day, April 2nd, U.S. put in 34% tariff on China. Now, the 34% was really the trade deficit divided by total trade. So lots of people made fun, or lots of people questioned whether that's a good way for the US to be calculating the tariff rate. But later on, I think we know that US did walk back and says a 90-day 10%. And I think the game was on for whether US China is going to talk. And, remember all the discussion about who calls whom and whether US China are talking or not. Now it's pretty clear that both sides have been very good in keeping the talks, pre-talks somewhat secret, and then nail down the final solution, which is that all the retaliatory tariffs after that 34% was taken off the table by the US, and China agreed to that. Obviously, China would like to agree to that. And then for that 34%, 10% will be kept in place. So that's very interesting because UK, which is a surplus country, by the way, US export to UK more than it imports. UK actually still have to pay 10%. So China also got 10% and 90-day extension. If further agreement does not improve, then the 34% will gradually be added back. So just to recap, what is the tariff rate on China now? Before 2025, there are about 20 or 16 or 13, depends on how you say it. Let's use 20% for easiness of calculation. So before 2025, there's already these extra tariffs on China. Most of them were imposed by President Trump during his first term. Then after 2025, President Trump imposed a 20% fentanyl tariff. The U.S. China did not retaliate in reciprocal tariff, but it did retaliate through other things. For example, increased tariff rate on imports of chicken, some of the farm imports, and also started controlling the important minerals that China has. Is very big player in processing of those minerals like the rares. And there, I do want to understand that there are a lot of misconception about the rare earth situation. US is actually very rich in rare earth minerals. It's just that the rare earth refining is very polluted. And US, obviously, it's a very rich country. People don't want in the backyard having that kind of very, very polluted industry, and you don't not necessarily have the people who want to work in these kind of industries. So US doesn't do refinery of those rare earths. So when you hear some headlines about China controls the rare earth supply chain, it's really about the refining. US can, if it really wants, do a lot of refining domestically, but I think for now it's just really the cost. So China started controlling those export, so those mineral prices went up significantly. Again, then the 20% fentanyl tax still stays, and then this 10% extra. So overall tariff rate on China, if you add the 20% before 2025, and then the 30% after 2025, so it's about 40%. But actually, I tweeted an image that broke down the tariff rate by industry. So you do have wide dispersion. Some industries have 20, 30%. Some industries are like 60%. So US is really imposing tariff, depends on how difficult to ramp up a production, or how difficult to substitute China's output. So I think overall it's about, average is about 43%, depends on how you calculate. So I think now obviously the market is very excited. Both China and the US market was very excited on Monday. But you can also see that the US market trades on tariff, but also trades on other factors. For the US, it's really physical, monetary, and foreign policy like tariff. So today US inflation is below expectation, which is generally good news, because the US wants to lower the inflation. So it is the equity is still very positive, but for Chinese equity, it has not gone up as much. And I think that brings down to this ultimate question to think about China in your portfolio, is that if you think about US, does US win or lose in this trade war so far? It's actually very difficult to assess compared to the original US goal, which is completely contain China using deals with other countries. That US didn't achieve. But in absolute terms, US ended up imposing 30% tariffs on China this year. So in absolute terms, US is not coming out too bad. So actually on my Twitter, I ran a poll, and I'm surprised that 80% or 50% people think that the US lost. I wouldn't say it's a US loss. US does lose some credibility, and also lose some future leverage, because in the future, when US put in huge goal, then the other countries are going to see how China is going to respond first. Because this time China was the only country that retaliated. Okay, China is the only one very high profile retaliated technically. European Union also retaliated, but I think the news media is giving them a little bit of break. And but it's true. I think US has a little bit difficulty signing the deals with countries like Japan and South Korea, because and even India to a certain degree, because they now have a little bit of leverage because China said no. So US does lose, compared to its original goal, does lose some leverage. China in the short term actually, lost quite some. First, you have to pay 30% tariff. Secondly, you're going to have to do re-export, which means Chinese exports going to have to route through different countries. It's going to increase costs for Chinese suppliers. And in some way, the U.S. consumers to a loss as well. Lower income people are going to have to pay more for cheaper Chinese goods. So again, obviously, the rest of the world, so ultimately, I think if you balance everything, U.S., China, the rest of the world, all kind of lost in a similar pattern. That's what I would put it. But obviously, emotionally, people don't necessarily think in that way. So I think this is really the most important topic. But again, U.S. equity doesn't just trade on a tariff, and similar for China. China right now is still in a very lukewarm macro situation. The CPI was negative in China, and the core CPI was positive, close to 0.54%. But that's still below full employment situation of usually 1.5% or 2% in China. So there are a lot of people who's underemployed in China. So again, I think ultimately, if people can take away from this episode, is that when thinking about the US and China right now, the politics is very driven by really one person, President Trump and President Xi. And this is not to make any value judgment. I think as an analyst, you have to take into account. And it's a lesson for myself as well. I think in early April, was very early to say that U.S. China will make a deal, and we need to be a little bit positive. But in the last 2 weeks, I was a little bit more cautious, because on the Chinese side, indeed, there's not much movement in terms of making a deal. But I didn't take into account that the U.S. side is much more willing to make the deal. Like, I think what President Trump has offered China, it's very hard for China to refuse. Essentially, it's giving 10%, like the rest of the world. That's exactly what China wanted. Didn't want to be singled out. And the fentanyl tax that was U.S. imposed on China, Mexico, and Canada, which is, a separate thing that these 4 countries will try to work out and hopefully reduce the drug access to typical Americans, because indeed, drug is a terrible thing, and I personally absolutely hope that these 4 countries can do something to reduce the drug. So that is actually something I think China viewed it as something to negotiate on the side. It's not necessarily the broad package of trade tariff. So in this sense, I think China did get what it wanted. U.S. also got what it wanted, and the rest of the world is not too bad off, too worse off. But going forward, China and U.S. are still going to negotiate, and there's still many battles on because it's not just trade, right? There are tech competition. That's the ultimate battleground. So again, I think, ultimately you want to have a diversified portfolio and also take risk within the risk that you can take. China right now is in a little bit of tactical positive side, because the news is generally very positive. But on the other hand, if you have China in your portfolio, a lot of these kind of political calculations will be, or sentiment will be reflected. Actually, domestically, many Chinese were questioning, like, with this deal, U.S. equity was up so much, but how can our own equity didn't go up as much? There were a lot of memes and jokes domestically made fun of the Chinese stock market. I think that shows that even in the locally, people are still seeing the challenges ahead for China, because ultimately U.S. do want to decouple, and China needs to find some way increase domestic consumption or increase export to other countries. China just signing deals with Brazil this morning. I haven't got time, honestly, to really read a lot of those deals. Those are actually pretty important deals. How China is doing trade with Latin American countries, while at the same time President Trump is in Middle East signing deals with Saudi Arabia for NVIDIA export. So a huge amount of competition still goes on between US and China. I think at this point, general rule is that you do want to have something, some exposure in your portfolio to China, which I actually believe as well. But again, how much risk you want to take? That's the ultimate investment question. Thank you, and give us feedback and subscribe to our podcast. You can also follow me on Twitter. I try to bring as much of my comments and the mistakes that I make. I think only by acknowledging them, then next time you can do better. Thank you.